all of these people are convinced that, oh, there are these horrible gaming addicts. Well, have you ever met one? No. Today, we're going back to the video game well, whence this all started. Our topic today is it's Asian Boss again. Just, I think some of you aren't clear. I didn't make this video. It is Asian Boss. And it is, do Koreans think gaming addiction is a mental disorder? Giving me a chance to talk about one of my favorite topics, which is the electronic culture of mainland Asia. I did pick this topic for a more self-serving reason as well. I have a second channel where I do video game related things. I write on the topic, as I may have mentioned, and I have a long article and an accompanying video coming out on independent video game production in 2023. It is on another channel. I hope you'll watch the video. I spent all year working on these things. But that's for later. I'll give you the link at the end of this video. Let's get to the main attraction, which again is Asian Boss. Do Koreans think gaming addiction is a mental disorder? Just for context's sake, this was made in 2019 at a time when there was a lot of discussion on this very topic. So let's get into it, starting now.
Hey guys, it's Marie from Asian Boss. You may have heard the recent news that the World Health Organization has decided to recognize gaming addiction as a mental health disorder. This decision is causing a lot of controversy in South Korea, which is well known for its gaming industry and dominance in electronic sports, also known as esports. So what do ordinary Koreans think about the WHO's decision? Do they agree with it? We hit the streets of Seoul to find out.
최근 세계보건기구에서 게임 중독을 질병이라고 지정했습니다. 네, 혹시 이에 대해서 들어보셨나요?
I suppose I should start with this before we get into the video proper. I'm not fully convinced that gaming addiction exists. I'm a little on the fence about a lot of these behavioral disorders that have been recommended, but a lot of that kind of ties into my views on the mental health profession in general, which are definitely negative. So I'll just say for me, whatever they end up saying here, it's possible for any sort of behavior to mess up your life. And it is worth noting that in most places, this is not listed as an addiction. It's more of a use disorder. The difference being things classified as a use disorder don't need to be addictive. There are use disorders for like anabolic steroids. There are use disorders for laxatives, things associated with body dysmorphia. So it's kind of a different category. It's a complex issue overall is what I'm saying. I won't ramble on any farther. Let's get back to the video.
들어본 적 있어요.
일단 SNS는 기본이고 학교에 가면 이런 얘기들로 많이 나오고 있어요.
논란이 어쨌든 한국에서 크게 일어났잖아요. 왜 한국에서 이렇게 이 이슈가 큰 논쟁이 됐다고 생각하시나요?
아마도 한국이 게임을 가장 많이 한 나라 중 하나가 아니어서 이러지 않을까 싶네요.
그럼 한국 사람들 게임 많이 하나요?
네, 진짜 많이 하죠.
왜 그렇게 생각하시죠?
제 남자친구도
So before we get into the why, this is true. Statistically, the Republic of Korea is, I believe, the largest per capita spender on video games. Not the largest overall. Overall, I think they're only about 4th or 5th because it's a relatively small population. But it is the largest per capita. They might have slipped down in those ratings the last couple of years, though. But at the time this video was recorded was very much a high watermark for spending on video games in this country. Continuing.
엄청 많이 하고 해서 막 싸우고 그러니까 그런 것 때문에.
그럼 그 온라인 게임의 빈도수로 봤을 때 일주일에 몇 번, 몇 시간 정도 하시나요?
저는 온라인 게임을 전혀 하지 않습니다. 네네. 원래 지는 걸 좋아하지 않아서 질 것 같으니까 하지 않는 것도 있긴 한데 그렇게 유익하지 않다라는 생각이 들어서 하지 않는 것 같아요. 네.
네, 좀 즐겨하는 편이죠. 한 3번에 한 30분? 그 정도?
하긴 하는데 그렇게 중독될 정도로 안 하고요. 기껏해도 2시간밖에 안 해서.
일주일에 3-4번 하고 한 2-3시간 하는 것 같아요.
네, 저도 한 3-4번 정도 하고 저는 한 5-6시간 정도 하는 것 같아요. 스트레스도 풀 수 있고.
Alright, so just to pause here, because they're talking specifically about online games. And the reason this is significant is that tends to be the big part of video games in mainland Asia. This is one of the reasons I want to talk about this. People fixate on Japan, which, as far as the actual games, isn't even that important anymore. Japan's kind of turned into a walled-off market. Mainland Asia, you tend to see fewer single-player games. Everything is multiplayer. I've mentioned before, a big part of that is just how dominant the computer is. PC and mobile are pretty much the entire industry in these countries. The console market is like 2 or 3% in China. I think it's up to maybe 5% in Korea. So these games tend to be online, and those can either be like MMORPGs, which are kind of the stereotype associated with these countries, or they can be competitive games, which are, some of those are what you're thinking of, Apex, League of Legends, Overwatch, Valorant, games like that, but also stuff like Cartrider, which is a Korean game. It's by Nexon, which is a gigantic company that no one in this part of the world's ever heard of, but they use that game a lot in competitions. So those are pretty much what you're looking at. There's not a lot of single-player games, although that market has been growing in this region in the last couple years. Continuing.
하다 보면 이제 고민거리나 그런 것도 생각이 안
You think about a
나고
different set of problems.
좋은 것 같아요. 할 때 좀 쾌감도 있고 해서 좋은 것 같아요.
그러면 어쨌든 간 게임을 즐겨하는 입장에서 이번 세계보건기구의 입장에 대해서 어떻게 생각하세요? 그것이 중독되면 질병이다라고 한 것에 대해서.
중독돼서 심해서 일상생활에 좀 방해가 되면 질병이라 생각해요.
약간 지나치면은 중독이 이제 병이 되잖아요. 마약이 된 것처럼. 그래서 게임도 어떻게 보면 마약의 일종이라고 보니까 병이라고 보는 건 맞죠.
이거를 왜 질병이라고 하는지는 모르겠는데 이거를 뭐 규제한다고 해서 규제를 할 수 있을까요? 전 그런 생각도 들거든요.
There is a history of regulating video games in Korea. It's not done as much anymore, but there used to be a lot of restrictions on, I don't recall, I believe there were some like hardware import restrictions, but mainly it had to do with regulating, I'm kind of curious as to whether we're going to start talking about the Pishibong, about the internet cafes, because it's a big part of the video game culture in China, maybe even bigger in Korea. But there have been a lot of regulations. Most of them have been relaxed to the point where they're really not there anymore, but they technically are still in effect. So that's Korea. Continuing.
그럴 거면 차라리 뭐 술이나 담배나 이런 마약은 별로 우리나라에 별로 없지만 그래도 그런 걸 더 규제를 강화하는 게 낫지 않나.
게임 중독은 솔직히 계속 하다 보면 뭐 마약처럼 될 수도 있는 건 인정을 하는데 실제 그거를 질병으로 간주를 해서 저는 거기에 또 대한민국에 적용되는 혜택을 봐야 된다. 그건 좀 아니라고 봐요.
저는 이게 게임 중독도 질환이다 하면은 쇼핑 중독이나 다른 중독들도 다 질환이라고 나와야 된다 이렇게 생각을 하는데 게임.
You know, depending on who you ask, compulsive shopping can be elevated that high. Again, these are falling into the range of compulsive behaviors, and behavioral addictions in general are very controversial. So let's just let the controversy lie and continue talking about this one. I don't want to open up new lanes of argument. Continuing.
게임만 나온 거라서 그거는 좀 해명이라고 해야 될까요? 그런 걸 피드백 좀 해줬으면 좋겠어요.
저는 게임 중독은 좀 더 심하다고 생각을 해요. 그런 일들로 인해서 살인도 많이 나고 그 중독으로 인해서 많은 2차 피해가 너무 발생해서.
God, there actually were. It's definitely one of those situations where the media blow things way out of proportion. But honestly, there have been homicides in Korea connected to video games. Now, there of course have been homicides in places connected to damn near everything. So the question is not, it's always a media issue, is not, oh, here's this really alarming story and let's assume that it's universal. Is this universal? Is there a pattern of violence? Is there a pattern of criminal behavior associated to this hobby, this behavior? And as far as I can tell, there isn't. It's just a handful of really alarming stories that people in Korea, and frankly also the United States, love to harp on when they want to go after people who, let's be honest, are pretty powerless. It's scapegoating. Continuing.
이거는 질환, 좀 심한 질환이라고 생각이 해요.
그러면 게임을 그렇게까지 즐겨하지 않는 입장에서 이번에 이 세계보건기구가 게임 중독은 질병이다라고 한 것에 대해서 어떻게 생각하세요?
이게 너무 심해지면 그 게임에 몰입해서 막 사람 죽이고 그런 사람들도 있잖아요. 그래서 그러니까 또 맞는 것 같기도 하고. 네.
그런데 많은 게임 유저분들은 이번 결정에 불만을 가지고 있거든요. 왜 불만을 가지고 있을까요?
자신을 부정하는 거 아닐까요? 자기도 이런 거 속해 있는데 질병이라고 하니까 좀 부정하는 것 같아요.
당연할 수밖에 없는 것 같아요. 그들의 입장에서는. 하지만 뭔가 어떠한 목적과 방향성을 추구해 가야 하는 건지에 대한 어떤 사회적인 시스템과 구조들이 더 건강한 사회를 만들기 위해서 이것보다도 더 좋은 게 있다라는 거를 취하게 됐을 때 당연하게 취미 정도로 즐길 수 있게 되는 것도 있지 않을까라는 생각이 들어요. 네.
그러면 개인적으로 그냥 열정적으로 게임을 하는 게임 유저와 게임 중독자 어떻게 구분지어진다고 생각하세요?
게임과 현실을 구별하고 자기가 즐기는 성까지만 하는 거는 즐기는 자고 그거에 미쳐가지고 현실이랑 구별을 못하면 그거는 중독이죠.
중독자들은 자신의 일상까지 해칠 정도로 그러니까 학교를 가야 되는데 학교를 가지 않고 게임에만 몰두한다든지 그거는 중독이라고 생각을 하고요. 뭐 자기가 밤을 새도 뭐 해도 자기의 일상이 지켜진다면 그거는 열정적인 거라고 생각을 해요.
게임을 하는 시간 차이가 아닐까요?
혹시 몇 시간 정도 어느 정도 게임을 하면 그때부터 게임 중독자라고 말할 수 있을까요?
하루에 10시간 이상?
Hard to defend 10 hours a day. This is really an attitude I think is pretty common in East Asia, mostly among older people, although looking at the people they interviewed for this video, most of them are probably under 30. So it's kind of interesting to hear this from the younger generation. It may just be the people they happen to speak to that day. I mean, let's be honest, again, as I say, with all these videos, we're talking to, 6 to 10 people, so you don't want to generalize what they say too much. That being said, this idea of it distracts from school and work and it ruins your life is very much the attitude that pushed both the Republic of Korea and the People's Republic of China to pass those regulations I mentioned earlier. There's a long history for this. I don't want to go into it now. I've written articles touching on the situation in both China and Korea, which I will helpfully link to in the description if you want to read more. And I hope you do want to read more of what I write, because this is just a sideline that I do. But yeah, these are attitudes even among people who do play video games. I think you would be surprised at how common this sort of thinking is in this part of the world, which, to be honest, they do run into problems, I think, more often than we do. Continuing.
일주일의 절반 이상, 그러니까 4일 이상이고 주말 같은 경우에는 뭐 10시간 이상? 보통 게임을 하게 되면은 6시간 정도가 보통 평균이라고 보는데 그 이상 넘어갈 정도면은 아마 그 기준이 그 정도 되지 않을까.
그러면은 본인은 아니시겠지만 주위에서라도 게임 중독으로 고통받는 그런 경우를 본 적이 있으신가요?
그런 경우는 본 적 없어요. 그런 경우는 그냥 보통 뉴스나
This guy's probably a little more skeptical.
PC방에서 게임하고 있었는데 어떤 사람이 PC방에서 불이 났었대요. 불이 났었는데 보통 불이 나면 피해야 되잖아요. 나가야 되고. 근데 자기 캐릭터 그거 키워야 된다고 승급이라고 해야 된다고 안 나와 불 나는데 계속 안 나와 게임하고 있는 거예요.
한국에 있었던 일인가요?
예, 한국 뉴스 본 것
I have
같아요.
no idea if the story is
그 사람은
true.
게임 중독자겠죠.
약간 일상생활에서 게임이 절반을 차지하는 사람은 봤던 것 같아요. 그 친구랑 전화를 할 때도 항상 게임
I'm gonna wait on this
중이었고요.
one.
그 친구랑 얘기할 때 항상 게임 얘기밖에 안 하고 만약에 잘 때도 잠도 잘 못 자고 약간 꿈도 약간 게임 꿈을 자주 꾼다고 하더라고요.
그러면 한국 정부
So again, what I said earlier about this all being media narratives, note that all of these people are convinced that, there are these horrible gaming addicts. Well, have you ever met one? No. This is extremely common, and let's not just localize this down to Asia. This is well-identified phenomenon in the United States forever, especially in terms of how we think about crime, immigration, things like the quality of our schools. You have this thing in the US where if you ask people about schools broadly, if you ask people, well, is the US education system good or bad? They'll say, oh, bad, we need to improve it dramatically. And then you ask them, well, what about your kid's school? Oh, our kid's school is great. Everybody thinks that they send their kids to the one good school in the United States. And why is that? Because the media narrative is that our schools are bad. Nobody actually thinks that on the ground. And this is how most people think they're immune to the messages they see in the press. They're not. Just because you don't go out and buy the exact product you see in a commercial right away doesn't mean it's not screwing with the way that you think. Continuing.
부가 어떻게 했으면 싶으세요?
I
그렇게
think this next section's gonna be
세계보건기구의
juicy.
의견을 좀 더 수용하고 그런 결정의 길을 따라가야 한다고 생각하시나요?
저는 일단 먼저 수용을 할 거면 거기에 대한 또 맞는 대응책을 왔어야 된다고 생각해요. 그거에 만약 대응책이 없으면 전 무조건 현 정부에 대해서 지금 실망할 것 같아요.
우리나라가 이미 게임에 대한
Yeah,
규제를
they do.
많이 하고 있고요. 그렇기 때문에 일부러라도 억제시키는 것 같아요. 이제 게임 중독을 예방한 차원에서 한다고는 하지만 막 셧다운제도 있고
Yeah, that's
이제 그
what I was
사람들이 이제
talking
모바일
about.
게임도 규제한다는 소리도 들리고 그래서 오히려 게임 한 사람 하고 싶어도 그냥 못하는 추세가 있죠.
한국에 셧다운제라는 그런 규제 방법이 있다고 말씀해 주셨는데 혹시 어떤 건지 조금 설명해 주실 수 있으신가요?
네, 그 예를 들어서 일정한 시간이 되면 막 밤이 되면 이제 청소년들은 이제 게임에서 자동으로 로그아웃이 되고 PC방에서도 이제 청소년들은 10시 반 10시가 되면 나가야 되는 그런 시스템이죠. 밤 오랫동안 게임 못 하게 하려고.
이 결정이 한국에 전반적으로 장기적으로 어떠한 영향을 미칠까요?
싫어하는 아이들도 있을 것 같아요. 이런 게 있으면 게임하는 것도 줄여지다 보니까 스트레스도 못 풀고.
긍정적으로는 그거 게임에 의지했던 사람들이 자기가 좋아했던 거를 찾을 수 있을 것 같고, 부정적으로 보면 이거에 또 다른 중독으로 이어지지 않을까 싶습니다.
솔직히 장기적으로 봤을 때는 그렇게 좋지는 않다고 봐요. 중독이란 게 정신병의 질환으로 들어가면 기록에 남는 걸로 알고 있어서 네, 다른 사람들이 봤을 때 더 안 좋게 보죠.
So I probably should say something about the stigma about mental illness in East Asia. It's something people have spoken to me. I've personally spoken to people in this part of the world who say they'd considered going to see someone, to see a mental health professional, and they don't do it because there's a real stigma attached to it in that part of the world. But again, first place kind of moving off the topic of the video, and second moving into a sensitive area. So let's just, I will just say that and then move on.
않을까. 정상적인 사람인데 질병, 정신병을 가지고 있는 사람처럼 되니까.
Yeah, say.
물론 게임 개발하시는
Okay.
분들 입장에서는 좀 안 좋을 수도 있겠지만 이거를 게임을 많이 하지 않고 조금만 줄인다면 그래도 그분들 입장에서도 좋고 서로 다 좋지 않을까 생각해요.
그러면 앞으로 한국 게임 산업의 미래
Okay, this is an interesting question. There are a lot of Korean video game development companies, although most of them are in mobile. As you'd imagine, that's the big growth sector here. There are some really big companies that make more, I guess you'd say, more serious games. I mentioned Nexon. Nexon, I want to put this on the record because Nexon made a game called Dave the Diver that is currently showing up on a lot of like indie game of the year lists, but it was made by a company that made a game called Dungeon and Fighter Online, which never had great market penetration in Western countries, huge deal in East Asia. And this is a game that has revenue into the 11-figure range, all right? That is the tens of billions of dollars. So this is not an indie company. This is not an indie game, obviously, and neither is Dave the Diver. I don't know why it's showing up on all these lists. I guess because Westerners haven't heard of Nexon. Their most famous game in this part of the world is MapleStory, which still has purportedly made $3 billion in revenue. And this is why I'm going to climb up on a soapbox just for, I promise this will be less than 30 seconds. It's why we need to talk more about East Asian culture as it relates to video games. No one ever does, and that's how you get a game made by one of the largest video game companies on earth referred to as an indie. Because nobody knows better, because nobody cares about East Asia other than Japan. Continuing.
어떻게 될 것 같으세요?
잘은 모르겠지만 뭐 좀 타격이 크지 않을까 싶네요. 일단 이제 정신질환을 이제 하면
이거를 규제를 한다고 해서 법으로 뭐 정한다고 해가지고 규제가 될 것 같지 않거든요. 뭐 예를 들어서 뭐 여기 금연구역 지정해놔도 담배 피는 사람 많잖아요. 그런 거 같이. 예.
앞으로 근데 더 발전할 것 같고, 근데 만약에 이런 게임 중독으로 인해서 2차 피해가 많아지면 좀 대안을 더 넣어서 만들지 않을까 싶습니다.
또 게임 사업이 요즘 저희의 그 유망 산업이기 때문에 거기에 전 더 넓혀야 된다 생각하고, 솔직히 저는 질병으로 인해 가지고 게임 산업가 저하될 거 안 모르고, 솔직히 저희 나라에 있는 법부터 그 게임에 대한 게임 업계에 대한 규제를 먼저 풀고서 하는 게 좀 저희는 그게.
The big issue there is the extent to which the East Asian, really Korea, but China too, whether these companies are continuing to make games for just mainland Asia or whether they go international. That's been a big discussion point, and I don't know why no one talks about this more. You have seen a lot more market penetration by Korean and increasingly even Chinese developers who before this were making games mostly for the region. Obviously, if the government decided to crack down more in these countries, the way it would affect the developers would be hit a lot harder if they were making video games primarily for the Korean market, which many of them do, but increasingly a lot of them have a more international focus. Especially in Korea. China's getting into it too. I mentioned Genshin Impact in the last time I did a video on this topic, and that's a game that's been a huge deal outside of China and outside of Asia. So realistically, it's going to depend on whether they're making, what market they're making games for. And increasingly, Korean developers are reaching outside. Dark and Darker is a game that's going to come out maybe next year, and that's looking like it's going to be a huge deal Korean game that's probably going to have a big splash in the Western markets. So even if they had cracked down, which they really didn't, I don't think it would have harmed the Korean developers as much. It screwed the Chinese developers up real bad, though. Continuing.
좀 영향을 미치지 싶은데요. 대한민국의 그런 좀 억누르는 법을 좀 없애야 된다 생각해요.
So what's your take on gaming addiction? Do you agree with the WHO's decision or not? Let us know in the comments below. For more authentic insight into the latest news and cultural trends from all over Asia, be sure to subscribe to Asian Boss and follow us on our social media. Thanks for watching, and as always, stay curious.
Okay. Now, as to... I probably should have brought this up earlier. There's actually a video game I've written several articles about this year because it interests me. And it's one of those games that is indeed a phenomenon of China, even though it has a really good English translation. There's a game that came out this year, actually an interactive movie, if you want to be technical, called Breakout 13, which is based on a very popular piece of Chinese web fiction, which itself is based on an actual story or actual events, inspired by actual events, as they say. They changed a lot. But the villain in this interactive movie is based on a real person. And the place where it's set is based on actually a couple different places that were these sort of tough love camps that they actually had in China, but were not. I think they actually had Korean people in them as well. They had similar facilities in Korea, I know. That, I mean, they used electroshock. So they were basically using aversion therapy. So they used shocks. Some of these places were known to employ pretty severe physical violence, especially the places where they were sending people away. So this is it's a serious issue in East Asia where there have been ugly abuses about this in the past. So that's something nobody in this video mentioned, and I'm kind of surprised because this had been in the press at the time, but no one was really talking about it. But, other than that, how do I always end this? Pretty much what I expected. Not a lot of huge surprises here, other than these people maybe being a little bit younger than I would have anticipated to have these kind of opinions. But now that that's out of the way, let me talk about my project very briefly. Again, it is on independent video game development. I interviewed more than 24 people for this thing. I don't believe I had any Korean developers. I have a hard time getting the East Asian people to talk to me. I think I had 1 or 2 Japanese developers in there. But again, the link, it's going to be up there. So please watch, please share it with your friends. Again, I worked all year on this. I'm really hoping that people get something out of it. Before you depart, I would hope that you subscribe. That helps me out a lot. And I will see you on another day with another video. Thank you very much, and have a good one.